Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek _ Deep Space Nine. A Stitch in Time. Andrew J. Robinson. EPUB window. Focus on book content text. 4 entry: The Bamaran Institute is located in the Highlands adjacent to the Micker. Book content text. Yes, I came for the... Before I could finish, a hand grabbed me by the hair and the lights went on. Facing me were 3 older students, perhaps level 2. Why did you come alone? The gruff voice was behind me, along with the owner of the hand that held my head facing front. When I tried to turn, the hand painfully tightened its grip. I thought that... You thought only of yourself. You didn't think of the group. From now on you are going to learn never to think of yourself apart from the group. At which point I was punched and kicked several times. I tried to resist, to fight back, but there were too many of them. I went down on my knees, trying to catch the breath that was knocked out of me. Clearly overpowered, I refused to cry and I refused to concede defeat. I would die before I did either. Enough. The gruff voice called out. One of my attackers pulled me up and another handed me 2 buckets filled with cleaning solutions and implements. Take them and go back to your section. And remember, 10 Blueback, this is what happens when you separate from your group. All individuals are hunted and punished. By yourself you're pudding. We're going to be watching you. I was pushed toward the door and the lights went out. The door opened, and as I stumbled through with the buckets I nearly bumped into another student who was waiting to go in. We looked at each other and I recognized the disapproval on his face. I thought of warning him, but something told me to return to my section. I hurried past him and heard the gruff voice call out, next. Book content text. 5 entry: Tell me, Mr. Thorak, Captain Sisko said, as he intently studied the view screen diagramming the Cardassian Union. Where do you think the Cardassian defense perimeter is most vulnerable? I laughed. How do you explain to an alien that's the one place where Cardassians are not vulnerable? The good captain gave me one of his bemused stares. The likelihood of any exploitable weakness, I replied, would be in the chain of command between the Founder's orders and the execution of these orders by the Vorta and their drug-addicted Jem'Hadar soldiers. If it's a perimeter put in place by the Cardassians, it won't be vulnerable. The captain gave me a skeptical look. That's a very confident assessment. Captain, Cardassians come into this life with an awareness of their protected perimeters, what the doctor calls our reptilian brain dominances, and die defending them. The captain nodded and turned back to the diagram. I almost added that, in between, we perfect this awareness at places like the Bamaran Institute. Book content text. 6 entry: Males and females of the first and second levels were kept separate at Bamaran. While we shared certain docents and outside training areas, each group had its own living quarters and facilities. It was explained to us that until we became disciplined in our relations with a complementary gender we would make better progress this way. When I asked one Tarnal how we would learn this discipline without interaction between the sexes, he blinked and mumbled something about distractions. When I asked what that meant I was told that I had a loose mouth and given 5 days of hygiene chamber maintenance as punishment. You don't know enough to ask so many questions. I started to ask him how could I learn without asking questions when he pulled out his merking stick, so named because they are used to be mercs, that's what first level students are called, and gave me a whack on the left and told me to get to the storeroom for cleaning implements. When the pain passed through me, I looked around for group support. You can be sure that this time I wanted to be accompanied by as many of my mates as possible. There were 5 students in the room, but when I made my request 4 of them gave excuses ranging from barely plausible to outright suspicious. 3 Blueback, the biggest in our section and the one I most wanted to go with me, said, the section leader's right. You talk too much. Unfortunately, the only student left was Quiet 8 Blueback, who kept completely to himself. He agreed to accompany me and quickly moved to the door. He was short and slender, and his dark eyes and long lashes made him look younger than the rest of us. He was almost too delicate for a Cardassian. I was not encouraged. But I had no choice. I went through the door, unconsciously imitating the gruff voice from my previous experience. All I need is an extra pair of eyes. Just keep them open, and let's get the job done. 8 said nothing and followed me out. The trip to the storeroom was uneventful, and we received our supplies without incident. On the way back, however, We noticed that an intersection of two corridors was much darker than before. Kate, who was walking behind, touched my shoulder. "I think we forgot something," he said with uncharacteristic loudness. He motioned for me to follow him. We backtracked to the previous intersection, made a right turn and continued down another corridor until we came to a third intersection. He stopped and took the cleaning implements from me and carefully put them down. He chose one that was attached to a pole and handed it to me. He took a shorter implement, looked around the corner down the darkened corridor and quickly moved to the other side. I started to follow him, but he made it clear that I should stay where I was and wait. All during this, Kate was quiet and controlled and as sure of himself as if he'd done this many times. How did he know where he was going? How did he? ? We heard footsteps coming down the corridor from the direction Kate had anticipated. He held up two fingers indicating how many people. We kept out of sight on either side of the corridor as they approached. His face was dark, intense with concentration. His brow ridges, which were unusually pronounced, cast shadows over his eyes. My heart began to pound when I realized what Kate was planning. These were certain to be older students, but he expressed no hesitation, no doubt. Just as the two unsuspecting students passed, the one closest to me caught sight of me, but it was too late. We were on them, and we both knew exactly what to do. First we disarmed them of their marking sticks with blows to their hands and arms. Then we laid into them with such ferocity that they fled down the corridor. "I'll show you who's pouting." I started to follow. Book content text. No. Again the strength of his voice shocked me. I stopped, and before I could ask why, we heard a high-pitched whistle screech out the emergency signal for immediate assistance we had just learned in a field training class. We grabbed our implements and ran as fast as we could all the way back to our section. We burst through the door, flushed and out of breath. Most of the group was present and wanted to know what had happened. In my excitement I started to tell the story when Kate dropped the pail with implements and grabbed my attention. He looked sharply at me. What? I stammered. I followed his nod to the door where one turtle was giving me a hard look. Kate moved to his sleeping area and quietly busied himself in his private compartment. I immediately shut up, gathered the implements and took them into the hygiene chamber. Shortly after, when we were alone, I asked Kate how he knew about the corridors. He didn't answer. He turned away and picked up his orientation chip and punched a code. I was about to comment on his rudeness when he turned back and handed it to me. It was a diagram of the rooms and corridors on the storeroom floor. We had all been given the schematics of the BamaRun spaces. I assumed that no one paid any attention to them. I didn't know then if I could ever call Kate a friend. Something about him was strange and impenetrable. But it didn't matter. At least I knew there was one person in my section I could trust. How I had misjudged him. It was obvious that Kate had what Carter Science called a ferocious spirit and that I could learn a great deal from him. Much of the focus of Carter Science education, especially during the early years, consists of exhausting and merciless physical training. The training area on Deep Space Nine always amused me. People struggling by themselves with weights and machines in front of a mirror. The results seemed more about strengthening the appearance of the body rather than the fiber of the character. Our training centers on trials of one person's skill matched against the skill of another. But where Klingons regard physical combat as the primary test of mastery, we begin at that level and then progress to the subtler methods of confrontation. There are enough levels of expertise for 2 lifetimes, but a student has to master each one before moving on to the next. It was during these trials that we came to know each other. We assembled in the burning sands of the pit, where each day we had long eye, hand, and foot sessions. The pit was the most feared training area at BamaRun. It truly took the measure of each student. These initial sessions were the fundamental underpinnings of all subsequent training. Basically, the concept was to teach the eyes, the hands, and the feet to operate independently, in order to function in countless combinations called stratagems controlled by the brain. The stratagems ranged from simple fight combinations of kicks and punches to complicated dances that resembled religious trance. Calyx, our martial docent, was a gnarled old man with one glass eye. It was rumored that he was an infantry ghoul who'd been demoted because he'd refused the privilege of executive status and had put himself in danger along with his men. It was after his demotion that he dedicated himself to mastering the stratagems. Of course we called him Calyx behind his back, since that was the name of the whirling muscular beast of many appendages in our childhood stories. Like the fabled Calyx, our docent was capable of blinding displays of fighting prowess, yet at rest he was about as remarkable as a rock dot. On the first day in the pit, we stood in formation for what seemed like hours while he simply stared at us. I was drenched in my fluids, nauseated by the baking sundae. 6 flew back fainted, and when 5 made a move to tend to him, Calyx spit in his face. As with humans, this is a humiliating, demeaning gesture. We were stunned. Step forward, 5. His voice was jarringly gentle and half-smile replaced the blank mask. 5 just stared at him, the spittle dripping from his face with the sweat. He behaved as if the docent had spoken an alien tongue. The mixed signals had confused us all. Book content text. Stand in front of me, Calyx motioned. 5 was compact, and his trained, athletic body moved carefully in anticipation of a trick. He stopped in front of Calyx, whose half-smile revealed broken and missing teeth. I want you to get me off of my place without losing yours, Calyx explained. 5 seemed transfixed by the half-smile. I wasn't sure he'd understood the request. I wasn't sure I'd understood. We remained in formation while they stood facing each other. This standoff lasted forever. 5 wavered, but he held his position, never taking his eyes off Calyx. My entire body was by now screaming in pain. The pit was in the far corner, away from the other training areas. Each was cut off by a barrier, so you couldn't really see what was going on in adjoining areas. Voices and sounds would drift in and out of awareness. My mind wandered. I was sure that I heard sounds of the women students gusting with the wines. Suddenly Mother materialized. She looked like she was apologizing. I wanted to tell her how much I missed her, but her image dissolved and Father took her place. I knew he was telling me something very important, but I was growing dizzy and afraid that I'd join 6 on the ground. His words were carried away by the wines. Father faded, and gradually I became aware of a figure entering from the right side of my peripheral vision. He was dressed in the student black and green, moving slowly across. No, she was dressed in the classic long skirts. This was against the rules. What was she doing here? She glided into full view and stood between Calyx and 5. The dry mica wines billowed her skirts and whipped her purple-black hair, obscuring her face. Did anyone else see her? I wanted to look around, to have my vision corroborated, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. She stopped and returned my look. Her hair whipped behind her, exposing her unguarded eyes. She said something, but again I couldn't hear the words. I moved to her. She was radiant. I was drawn to her. Everything else fell into shadow, as if I were moving through a tunnel. Where are you going, 10? You're losing your place. It was the gruff voice from the storeroom. My female vision reacted to the voice and looked in the direction from where it came. I followed her look, and just as I began to discern the outline of another person, tall, graceful, an emerging negative image of a picture, I experienced an icy, painful spasm that pulled me back to the pit. It was as if my heart had been crushed in a strong grip. I staggered and nearly fell. You look lost, 10. I turned to the voice, which now was familiar and no longer gruff. It was Calyx, and I was standing in front of him. What happened to 5? I wanted to look. I wanted to look for the young woman, for the gruff voice. But I didn't dare take my eyes away from Calyx. Did you see them or hear them? He asked. I hesitated, wondering how he knew. Both. I replied. Did you recognize them? My parents. Not the other 2. Someone behind me started to laugh, but Calyx stopped him with a look. The other 2. Is that when you lost your place? I nodded. His questions were softly asked, almost kindly. I don't know why I wasn't surprised that he knew. Instead, I was grateful. It told me I wasn't going mad. You have your work cut out, 10. I nodded again as if some part of me understood what he meant. Are you up to this? Can you learn to hold your place? I just stared back at him, not knowing how to respond. Softly he blew 2 accurate breaths into my eyes and, blinded, I stumbled back. Can you even find a space to hold? He asked. I came back to my sweating body and felt totally exhausted and beaten. We were dismissed, and I watched everyone move away. I had no idea of what had just happened to me. My work was cut out. Calyx had told me I had to find my space and hold it. How do I even begin? Book content text. 7. And how do we even begin to rebuild a world that doesn't exist anymore? The world that exists in my mind with the same arid bitterness as the dust in my mouth. I have never lived with despair, Doctor, the way I live with it now. It's almost like a phantom companion that shadows me and casts doubt on whatever I do. Why save him? It asks, as we remove a young boy from the rubble of a school. You're only keeping him alive for a future of privation and chaos. Wouldn't it be more satisfying to join the burial unit? I want to scream at this phantom, to shut it up. Once I turned around suddenly and raised my hand to strike it. When I realized it wasn't there, it was too late. Everyone in the unit was looking at me. I'm sure I must have looked like a madman. Dr. Parmack tried to send me home, but I refused alone. It's even worse. He offered me a relaxant, and I put it in my pocket. Later, I said, "It'll make me drowsy now." And we continued to dig for more children. When I returned to my shed, the rare rain was falling. I was chilled to the bone. I found the last of my Rocasa juice and settled in front of the open door. I removed the pill Dr. Parmack had given me and I swallowed it with a gulp of juice. I watched the rain mix with the hazy dust and turn everything into a muddy swamp. As my muscles relaxed, figures began to emerge from the haze and take shape. They stood there indistinct, silent, turned toward me as if awaiting my instructions or decisions. There was nothing threatening about them. Indeed, they were only the outlines of childlike bodies, standing patiently. My despair was finally in abeyance, and I experienced a relaxation I hadn't known for a long time. I began to think that they were my old Bamaran schoolmates, and I wanted to speak to them, to welcome them back into my life. Yes, I thought, relief from the horror. I must get more of these pills from Parmack. As I tried to put faces on the shadowy children, they began to approach me. They became more distinct as they moved through the rain and haze. Can you believe it, Doctor? They weren't my schoolmates. They were the Cardassian orphans from the resettlement center on Bamar we once visited. The orphans left after the Cardassian occupation forces withdrew. The same young girl was their leader and her lips formed the same question. Have you come to take us home? I jumped up. I felt the shed closing in, threatening to swallow me. I ran out into the rain and gloom. There is no home anymore. Can't you see that? Look around you. It's gone. I screamed at them and fell to my knees in the sodden waste. They continued to stare back with that same look of fragile trust that I would somehow relieve them of their fear and bring them home. I couldn't look at them anymore and dropped down into the muck. My despair was no longer just a voice, it was this monstrous world the evil had created, and it surrounded and overwhelmed me. I don't know how long I remained curled up in the mud. I felt myself being lifted and half carried, half dragged back into my shed. It was Dr. Parmack. He cleaned and changed me as best he could. He prepared a cup of Tarkalian tea, which made me think of you, Doctor. How ironic, another doctor pulls old Halim out of the muck of his despair, but this time he's a Cardassian. Parmack offered me another pill, but I declined. I am afraid they don't react well with me, I explained. I understand, he said. I wonder did he understand that I have to live with this brutal reality live in it! Without hope of a cheap escape. Just as I learned to live on Deep Space Nine without a wire that anesthetized my pain. The same harsh lesson. I'm sure he did. After all, he has to live here, too. And he's a doctor. A Cardassian doctor. Perhaps there's hope for us yet. Book content text. 8 entry: All the lessons at Bamaran were harsh. Like my father, no one wanted to repeat an order or instruction. If they did, you paid the painful price. If you had to relearn a lesson, it was made doubly difficult. Consequences always escalated. Like every other group, the 10 of us traveled in a tight and disciplined pack. We covered each other's backs and punished stragglers who jeopardized our safety. We learned very quickly that group integrity was paramount. Individual effort an alternative only when there was no group solution. The lessons I came to look forward to in Level 1 took place in the actual Mucker Wilderness. At irregular intervals we were taken out to desolate areas and, depending on the exercise, were assigned to hunt as a group or evade capture as an individual. If it was the group hunting exercise, we were told that a certain number of individual enemies were operating somewhere in our part of the wilderness, and that our task was to track them down and take them into custody. We were given no supplies, no navigational instruments, and no information as to their location. If we returned without having captured all of them, our mission was considered a failure. Needless to say, all failure at Bamaran had serious consequences. We were quite successful at the group exercise. Since we had no idea in which direction to begin our hunt, we used an elaborate system of whistle calls and signals as we radiated out from a central base. When one individual was located, only those hunters in that particular quadrant were assigned to apprehend him. The others continued the search in their respective quadrants, and we all reported back to the center, with or without our prey. There was only one instance when the length of the hunt far exceeded our supplies, such that by the time we returned to Bamaran we were all dangerously dehydrated and exhausted. 6. The student who fainted in the pit had the hardest reaction to this exercise. He was studious, and excelled in a classroom situation, but while he wasn't as slight of build as he didn't have the latter's stamina. For a while he was near death, and spent nearly 2 months in recuperative care. It was to his credit that he returned to the group. We learned about each other through this training. One of the things that quickly became apparent in the pit, the classroom, and the wilderness was that our initial numerical designations were not truly indicative of ability. The numbers assigned to us were presumably based upon our previous school performance record. But just as important and rarely mentioned were our family and class status. 8 also came from a service family background, and it was soon clear to everyone that he should have been designated one Lubac, a fact not lost on the actual holder of that designation who, judging from his behavior and speech, came from the highest echelons of our society. 9, however, came from an important political family but was as dim as a moonless night. 3 wasn't much brighter, but his physical size and strength as well as his family's connection to power gave him a higher place. The patterns of political alliance within the group had about them the inevitability of iron filings on a magnet. To keep the low-born but gifted 8 in his place, 1 immediately recruited 3 and 9. Not only were they of the same class, but 1 could mentally dominate them. 2 went along with this group, but his political adeptness enabled him to remain on good terms with everyone. 4 also went along with this group, but the only thing that captured his interest was finding a way to make contact with the women. This preoccupation and his well-developed shoulder ridges made him seem older than the rest of us. 5 was an athlete who also did well in class. I could see that he was attracted to 8, as indeed I was. 7 seemed to be the youngest and most unformed of the group. He was another service merc, and his allegiance went to whatever person he'd spoken to last. 6, when he wasn't recuperating, preferred his books and kept his distance. He wanted desperately to succeed at Bamaran, but he was vexed by his physical limitations. We all knew that these allegiances and predilections existed under